Agents. Okay, thank you. I was just told this meeting is being recorded. This landscape can be changed with human intervention. We've created, as a species, we've created lots of problems, but we also can do a lot of good. So after 2 years of good water management, that same scene looks like that. We know how to bring things back to life. So now what do? We reframe the problem, not as a carbon dioxide problem, but as a problem of biodiversity and healthy ecosystems and all that those things do. Nature's power is extraordinary. We've been in a civilization for a long time, and civilizations, not just this one, get very detached from the power of the natural world. We get kind of drunk with our own hubris, but nature prevails. And of course, the current coronavirus is a really good lesson for that and kind of puts us in our place. And I would mention here that the root causes for coronavirus and the climate are pretty much the same, and that is the destruction, the widespread destruction of the biosphere. This is what, it's not a tree of life as Darwin had it. It's gotten more complex in our understanding, but there are all of these pathways that living things have taken to evolve into other things of almost infinite variety. Earth is a unique planet in the solar system, and it's hard to tell at this point, but very possibly in the universe. And it got that way because of living things. Here's an example of different metals, different rocks that they're found normally all over the universe. There are about 1,500 kinds. On Earth, there are more like 5,000 kinds, species of these minerals. And the earthly species have been changed. An extraordinary variety here that is not found anywhere else. Here you see bacterial mats, these yellow and orange spaces that they're called microbial mats, and they hold ecosystems together. They create islands. They bring, they extract minerals from rock that lead to other biodiverse systems. And here are very tiny example of microbes of different sizes and shapes and species and families. And it's extraordinary how much variety there is. And it's worth noting that life on Earth has invented molecules that exist nowhere else. And just about every biochemical process that we know of was developed by microbes billions of years ago. Here's an example of one tiny creature. It's a phytoplankton, a plant cell that floats in the ocean, has no way of moving itself around, but it goes with the currents. And it creates these beautiful calcium carbonate shells. Each cell has these shells. And these cells capture lots of carbon. They fall to the bottom of the ocean. They show up in huge blooms from time to time. This is southwest England. London would be on the upper right, and these are the blooms of Emiliana that you can see from satellites. And they're the same cells, those calcium carbonate shells, building up into what became the cliffs of Dover. They were at the bottom of the ocean, and there was tectonic uplift, and there we have countless living things that are creating the surface of the earth. These are chloroplasts with cyanobacteria that became incorporated into the cells as a collaborative symbiotic association. And that's the basis of all the green plant life on Earth. And they gave us an oxygen atmosphere. Around 1.2 billion years ago, there was an event called the Great Oxidation event, in which the anaerobic bacteria went into hiding because oxygen is a very toxic gas, except that it is a very powerful substance that causes chemical transitions and turned out to be much more efficient and effective for life forms. We still have anaerobes and we need them, but that was a mass extinction that happened 1.2 billion years ago that changed the face of the planet. So how do we heal what we have disturbed so extensively? And we have some experts to help us. And this is one such expert. Cows get a bad rap because they've been mismanaged by humans. When nature manages ruminants on grasslands, which co-evolved over 25 million years or more, when nature manages those animals, they move in fairly tight herds for protection from predators, and they'll eat and they'll poop and they'll pee and they'll disturb the soil in a good way. And then they'll, since the fresh grass is gone, they'll move on. And as I said before, one creature's waste is another's feast. And the soil organisms have a ball and create all kinds of substances that not only keep carbon in the soil, but open up the soil to water, make it open to air, as opposed to soil that has been tromped down without the healing effects of the animals that really belong there. It's obvious that without the grasslands, the cows die, but it's not so obvious that without the cows, the grasslands die, because the grasses evolved to be eaten up to a certain point and to be fertilized. And during dry seasons, when microbes in the soil die from the heat, the microbes in the cow's gut restore those microbial populations in the soil. Here's another expert. There used to be hundreds of millions of beavers in this country, and many places that are deserts today were grasslands in the past. And much of that is thanks to beavers, which were everywhere until the 16th century or so, when they became a big fad as hats. And the Europeans did the beavers in there, and then they got over here and they discovered this infinite wealth of beavers and nearly drove them extinct. Fortunately, now they are recovering. And finally, there are earthworms that aerate the soil and provide nutrients. The earthworm castings feed all kinds of other soil organisms. And you may or may not know that Charles Darwin's last book was about earthworms, and he would just watch them for hours, and he wrote this wonderful book about them. So here's some examples. This is from Slovakia. Košice is a city in Slovakia, and apparently they have pizza too. But these are erosion gullies that are a result of mismanagement of the land. With proper water management, in 9 months, it turned into that. It's got all kinds of plants growing up where there were gullies. Eventually, the silt will accumulate and it will just grow more and more as long as we take good care of the land and the dog in this case. And this is something about how it works. It's kind of human beaver type activity. They're called check dams. And these are erosion gullies on logging roads. They're not streams. And when the logs are put across the streams, they hold back the silt. They let the water through. And as the silt accumulates, things start to grow. You can see in the right-hand picture, there's plants that are starting to show up behind the logs. And eventually you have a restored ecosystem. Here's an example from Zimbabwe, land that's been overgrazed for years. And overgrazing means that animals are kept in one place pretty much, and they just keep eating the same plants over and over again till they die, and then they don't come back. Eventually they would come back, and nature would see to it, but it could take hundreds of years. It's not something we would see in a human time frame. But after 3 years of good management, that turns into that little red circle is around, this is called the elbow site because of that tree. So that's the same tree in both pictures. And that's just 3 years apart using a technique called holistic plant grazing, which was developed by a wildlife scientist named Alan Savory, whom you may have heard of. And just as a point of interest, Alan was not welcome in academic circles, excuse me, because his views were so contrary to the prevailing views. And he spoke at Tufts in 2013 for the first time in 30 years on an academic campus. And he had a very successful talk. Bill Muma helped bring him to the campus. Here's another example in Mexico. A rancher wanted to collect water for his cattle and got a backhoe and dug a big hole. And so you can see what the landscape looked like, excuse me, for miles around. And it took a while because there's not much rain in the Mexican desert. But after 25 years of careful management, that turned into that. And there's probably something like 6 times as much water in that scenario than there was in the one with the big pool. So we know how to do this. It's a well-practiced and tried and true approach to managing nature. So now I have a question for you. So you're gonna have to raise your hand or speak or something. But this is, used to be my front yard, and it was 90 degrees out, and I took the temperature with my handy dandy, highly scientific kitchen thermometer and measured it from under the bushes across the lawn to the asphalt. And the question is, surprise quiz, the question is, what do you think the difference in temperature was from the coolest place to the warmest place in this picture? I don't know, can you just popcorn style shout it out? I don't know if that's possible. Anybody?
People can type it on the chat box. I say 7 degrees.
Okay, let me open the chat box. Chat box. Anybody else? Don't seem to be getting to the chat box. Oh, there we go. 30 degrees, 20 degrees, 10 degrees, 40 degrees. Okay. All right, so the difference here, thank you all, the difference was 60 degrees Fahrenheit, 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And that is an indication of what shade and water can do. Of course, it's cheating a little bit because the asphalt, as we know, gets very hot, but it is an illustration of how we are affecting the biosphere, how we can affect the biosphere, either unconsciously or intentionally. So here's an example of a process in managing water that we should know about. On the left side of the screen, you see the water evaporating over the ocean. And as you move towards the right, there are there's a depiction of what's called the biotic pump. And this is of particular interest on the eastern coast of South America. And what happens is the forests on that coast transpire water vapor. So it goes up into the atmosphere where it condenses and turns into rain. Well, it condenses and it does turn into rain, but when it condenses, it creates a vacuum. So it pulls the water from the ocean over the land, and it keeps doing this. And that's what keeps the Amazon forest wet. And now that many of those trees have been deforested, the Amazon is starting to dry. One of the wettest places in the world is gradually turning into a savanna, a grassland that is, as you know, the Amazon is a very important place for our planetary function, and it is being changed. But we, in theory anyway, have control over that by maintaining forests and other aspects of the natural planetary system. Now, from another perspective, here's a view of what are called urban heat islands. And the hottest place there is Chicago. You can see right in the middle, that's Lake Michigan. And beneath that or around that is a collection of very, very warm places. So this is not a heat island from one city. This is an aggregate of heat islands. And that has a very important effect on weather and livability. This is a picture of Washington, D.C. And NOAA did a study of the temperatures on a hot day. It was 85 was the ambient temperature. And all the brown places, the darker they are, the warmer they are. There was a 17-degree difference on the same day in different parts of the city. And we've seen similar maps in Cambridge. We have a lot of control over the temperature. If we were to manage it well, we would cool large areas of the biosphere and change atmospheric dynamics more than we ever imagined possible. I wrote a paper called Weather from the Ground Up and I can put that in the chat for Weather Underground, where we're talking about how much power we have to change the way things work. Well, here's another example. In Rajasthan, which is the driest state in India, um, there was devastating drought. And this is a river on top. And a man named Rajendra Singh, who's known as the waterman of India, discovered rediscovered an ancient technique for collecting water. And the villagers were very skeptical at first, but he he did it himself, and they were persuaded. And since then, he's had an impact on over 1,000 villages in India on restoring water. So you can see the difference in 15 years between the two habitats. Here's another example in the US. This is 1989 in northeastern Nevada, and a fisheries biologist and a rancher got together. The fisheries biologist, name is Carol Evans, wanted to see the trout come back to the area, and the rancher wanted more grass and water for his cattle. So they started doing holistic plant grazing, which I mentioned before with respect to Zimbabwe, and gradually the land started coming back. And as there was more water, somehow the beavers figured out that that was someplace for them to start to get to work, and they did. And it took a while. There's not much rain in Nevada, but after 25 years, and there was gradual improvement over that time, after 25 years, that scene looked like that. And you can see that Beaver Dam across, uh, across the stream. And this was 2014, I think, 2015, 8 inches of rain, 4 years of drought. And this scene had plenty of grass and plenty of water, because what happens is that when the animals, the grazing animals, open up the soils and the worms and the beavers come back, the water goes down into the water table and raises the water table. So there is surface water all year around. And this has been done many times in various parts of the world. And it's fundamental to the way nature works. It's not, there are no tricks here. It's just developing a sense of harmony with the biology that um, that has its own way of working. And I think that is indicated to a great extent by the coronavirus. I think it's teaching us a lot about the way nature works. It is related to the destruction of the biosphere and the encroachment by humans on wild landscapes and driving animals out, as well as capturing them and putting wildlife in a wet market. These are all related. So when we deal with the coronavirus at its root cause, we are also dealing with climate. We're dealing with all manner of ecological destruction. So here's an example of what people do in cities. They tear up the asphalt in the backyards. And because this particular example is in Massachusetts, where we get 45 inches of rain a year, plants, seeds are just waiting to sprout and come back to life. In Maryland, the state encourages people to do rain gardens. So rather than flooding into sewers and creating all kinds of havoc in the water system, the rain is redirected into soils where there are plants, and it makes a big difference on the biosphere in general. And here's an organization you may not have heard of. It's called La Via Campesina. It's a peasant movement that represents 200 million smallholder farmers around the world who are doing regenerative agriculture, agriculture that improves the land where food is grown, uh, uses no toxics. Uh, Via Campesina supports the rights of women and education of people all over the world so that um, these changes are more and more available to people. And in fact, they're necessary. They're part of a movement that we at Biodiversity for a Livable Climate called Blessed Unrest. Is named after a book written by Paul Hawken about 13 years ago. And he describes the work that people are doing in their own little corners of the world, bringing their land back to life. It's the largest movement that the world has ever known, and nobody hardly has ever heard of. And it is one of the most promising things around, one of the most hopeful things around for climate, for pandemics, for human health, for cooling the biosphere and growing all kinds of biodiverse ecosystems. And I just want to let you know that we are having that conference online starting this Saturday for over a period of 6 weeks, um, where some of the people who have been at work here, uh, like with Via Campesina, but many different organizations, from individuals to um, innovators and scientists, talking about how we actually can do this. We can change the world one lawn at a time, because lawns, of course, are our biggest crop, and a biodiverse, as far as biodiversity is concerned, they're a disaster. And we can turn lawns into food forests and create wildlife corridors to reestablish the species that have been so devastated by the um,
use of chemicals.
what did Greenspan say? Irrational exuberance of our civilizations and our growth. We can go back to small and local, even with the number of people we have, and make a very different world. As far as nature is concerned, as far as human behavior is concerned, that's still an open question. But nature can do it, and we know how to help nature do it. And the movement is growing by leaps and bounds. So I hope you'll continue to be a part of it. And so that's what I have to say. I'd be very interested in hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Adam. Okay, so I guess we'll open it for questions now. So remember, if you want to ask a question, raise your hand. Oh, there's a question on the box. Can you see
In the
that?
chat
Adam?
box. Okay.
So
Sure.
should I read it out loud? Can you read it out loud so everybody can see it,
Yeah,
just in case?
it's from Colin. Thank you so much. Your talk reminds me of the book recently published by Doug Tallamy. Yes, I'm a big fan of Nature's Best Hope. It is an important book that highlights how work in our own yards can be impactful. The question is, what do you think is the largest barrier to the adoption of holistic management, a practice that appears to be so promising? I think the largest barrier to all of this is, I hate to use the phrase human nature, but that is as close as I would get to it. We evolved as small group animals, and we do not scale up well we develop cultures which are important um, glue for our survival. And in the prehistoric world, there were the means by which we learned more and more about our habitats, which did not generally change very quickly. And so we've developed the kind of cultural uh, context for believing something and sticking with it. And we don't have much of a a very strong ability yet to adapt. I think, I don't want to get political, but I think there are certain politicians that we know of who have no ability to adapt. They have become completely imbued with culture to the point that they can't see beyond it. There was a book written in the 1960s by a scientist named Thomas Kuhn. It was called Structures of Scientific Revolutions, and he applied the word paradigm to a particular scientific view. And he noted how difficult it was for scientists to change their paradigms despite overwhelming evidence. And the famous physicist Max Planck said at one point that paradigms shift one funeral at a time. And that's a tough way to do it. But here we are now in a dominant paradigm of endless growth and consumption, which, by the way, is not limited to our current civilization. It seems to be a characteristic of civilizations and a characteristic of humans as we get into larger and larger social constructs. So I guess a long way around answering the question of the largest barrier to the adoption of holistic management, I think it's our evolutionary and cultural histories, and it's what happens between our ears. We know that people, from long experience, that people would rather die than change their paradigms, and we've got all kinds of wars and ecological destruction examples to show that. And the question is, what do we do with that now? I think there's been a major response to what nature is doing, particularly in the past 3 years, as we've gotten to hit that point on the hockey stick, the inflection point where things start to accelerate rapidly, and it's hard not to notice. And so we don't know what to do with it yet, but we do know that we have to do something. So this is a very interesting time.
Other questions? I have one. Can
Oh,
you hear
okay.
me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear
Oh,
you.
there's
Another
another one. Okay.
just popped up.
So you want to read it?
As I understand it, I'm no expert on this, mosquitoes breed in stagnant water. And I'm guessing that for the most part, rain gardens are not stagnant water. As the soil gets healthier, it can absorb a huge amount of water. We have a great little video that I would recommend to all of you. It's called Soil Carbon Cowboys. And in it, there's a segment where one of the ranchers talks about the drought that he went through in the 90s, and he had to make changes even though he didn't want to, and so he started to make those changes. And at the beginning, his soils would absorb about 1 inch of rain an hour. And after the soils became healthy again and open and moist, and by the way, storing lots of carbon, they could absorb 8 inches or more rain an hour. So what used to be floods turned into a great blessing for the landscape in that it became rich with water and everything else that water makes possible. So Coco, what was your question?
So my question is, well, first of all, thank you for the really cool example showing the before and after of what you can do with holistic management. But I wanted to ask you if you could comment a little more about the fact in your talk description, or maybe we discussed this before the talk, um, you propose holistic management um, as a more powerful tool than reducing greenhouse gases. And I wanted to see if you can talk more about it and give some more detailed
Yeah,
comparisons why you think that's the case.
great question. Thank you for that. Um, well, first of all, um, we have seen, if you look at the carbon cycling system of the planet with human interventions and all these other things, whatever it is,
I'm
put that
having that
all into a
problem.
black box
I'm not having.
and look at what's coming in and what's going out. So what's coming in is the elevated carbon dioxide levels, and what's going out is more elevated carbon dioxide levels. The mechanism inside that black box, which is very complicated and includes probably as much or not, if not more than anything else, it includes the human component. It's that black box is not working. The levels keep going up and up. The other, if you want to call it black box, the eco-restoration paradigm, regenerative paradigm, is storing billions of tons as we go in various land use improvements. And so which would you do? The one that isn't showing any results, or the one that has been showing results for decades? So that's the question that I ask, and um, it's a much more hopeful and promising approach. Does that make the land management more important? I think it does. I think it absolutely does. So we can have, I mean, we know right now, you saw from the example of the heat in the city, of the front yard, um, and there are many more. Um, we know that we can cool the biosphere. We can change the water cycles. We can grow abundance in spite of the elevated greenhouse gas levels. Now, I'm not saying that at some point those levels could get to be so high that they're impossible to deal with. But in point of fact, right now, we can do all of those regenerative things. And there's another good example. A couple of permaculturists, uh, Eric Tonesmeyer and Jonathan Bates, were up in the mountains in New England, and they decided they wanted to try out all this cool permaculture stuff that they developed. And they bought a house on 1/10 of an acre in Holyoke, Mass, which is a depressed post-industrial town. And they spent the next few years turning their front and backyards into food forests. And if you go to paradiselot.com, you'll see what they've done, and you can also buy their book. It's well worth looking at, because we could do this on every lawn in America. We could. Will we? I don't know. I doubt it. I mean, this is kind of along with what Colin was saying about nature's best hope. Doug Tallamy's book, new book. Tallamy is suggesting that we create wildlife corridors and pollinator friendly situations everywhere there's a lawn. It's not that hard, and it's not that expensive, and it has so many benefits. But how do you get through the cultural blocks in people's minds?
Wisconsin. Yeah.
So I don't know. Does that help?
Yes, thank you. Any other questions? There's another one on the chat box. Would you mind reading it for whoever?
Sure. Well, certainly, okay, the question is, those pictures of the restored habitats were very encouraging. How practical do I think it is to scale those regenerative practices up to something like the deforested areas of the Amazon? I would strongly encourage you to come to our conference called Blessed Unrest, because there will be people demonstrating the answer to those kinds of questions. I think there are already people who are trying to do that work. But again, it's a question of scale, it's a question of commercial and governmental interventions, destructive interventions. Again, the biggest piece of this puzzle is human behavior and human perception and cultural change. I mean, if it became really cool to regenerate land, which it should because it is, and people jumped on board the way they do with Beyonce or, you know, any of a number of other situations, then you know, we'd be home free. I mean, we can. It is possible. Nature will do this. If you some of the coronavirus stories that come out are of these natural systems that are already starting to recover when people stop tromping on them. It's remarkable, but we don't have a good sense of it yet, and that's what Bio4Climate is trying to do, and that's what I hope you all will be doing as you get out into the world and impress upon people how vitally, it's even silly to say this, how vitally important nature is. I mean, there is nothing else for us without nature.
Any other questions?
I don't know that I answered the deforested Amazon questions. The Amazon will come back when we take care of it. And there's certainly many indigenous people who want to take care of it, as well as others. It can come back. It's up to us.
Great. Well, if there are no other questions, what I will do is I'm going to create a breakout room for my students. Everybody else can stay here and hang out and ask more questions to Adam or talk to among each other, I guess. And so with that, thank you so much, Adam. It was a great pleasure to hear your story, and we'll see you again. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
And I'll put some information in the chat box for people to follow up.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you, Adam, very much.
Thank you, Colin.
On behalf of Environmental Studies, and it was great that George could bring you to us. Thank you, George.
Yeah, and
my pleasure.
Yeah, I hope we get a chance to sit down and chat one of these days soon.
Yes. Who knows when that will